Welcome to session 2 of my Building Your SAP Business One On-Demand Cloud System. Remember, the purpose of these sessions is to show you as an SAP partner how you can utilize the infrastructure as a service platform provided by Tata Communications under the banner of their Instacompute product platform and build your own cloud offering. Utilizing that infrastructure as a service, putting together all the necessary components, including the SAP Business One Cloud Control Center. So in session 1, what did we go through? Well, we went through the process of creating your account on the TATA Instacompute platform. We talked a little bit about that, and then we created our two critical pieces of infrastructure, or our two virtual machines that we need in order to manage all of your accounts. We created our primary domain controller, and for failover and redundancy, we also created a backup domain controller, because remember, with SAP Business One On Demand, when you're building your hosting infrastructure, you're going to be using Microsoft Active Directory as the repository for containing all of your SAP Business One cloud accounts. So all of the users that are going to be utilizing the system, they're all going to have accounts set up for them inside Active Directory. So the next step is we need to now create our additional virtual machines. So which ones do we need to create? Well, we need to create our SQL server, we need to create our remote desktop server, and we're also going to need to create our cloud control center. So I'm going to create 3 more instances on the Instacompute platform. So let's do the SQL server first. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say add instance. And again, remember, we want to make sure that we choose the same zone for all of our instances. So this is going to be Singapore. Give that a couple of seconds, allow that to refresh. So this is going to be, again, and all of our instances are going to be Windows 2008 R2 instances. So that's the one that I want. And then I'm going to go to step 2. And now this is going to be my SQL server. Now remember, for this machine, we're going to want to be able to host around about 100 concurrent users. So in that particular instance, for my SQL server, I'm going to want to allocate 8 cores and 40 gigabytes of RAM, because I want to make sure that my SQL server is going to perform at its optimal. So I'll choose that, and then I will pop down here and I'll say go to step 3. Then our data disk offering. Well, I'm actually going to want to have 3 different data disks. I want to have one for my TempDB, I want to have one for my databases, and I want to have one for my transaction logs. That way I'm going to maximize my throughput on my disk I/O. So the first one I'm going to create, well, I'll create, I think I'm going to create my database. So I'll create a 1 terabyte disk. I'm going to come back afterwards and create the additional disks that I need for the other, for the TempDB and for the transaction logs. So I'll go to step 4. And again, this is going to be connected via the internet. So that's what I'm going to choose. Go to step 5. So now I'm going to give it a name. So this is SBO Demo CL, and I'm going to call it SQL A. So in this case, I've decided I'm going to name my SQL instances A, B, C, and so on, just in case I need to have multiple SQL instances. So what's my group? Well, remember we called it SBO Demo CL. That's all good. So now I'll say submit. And you can see now that that instance is now being created. So let's go and let's add another instance. Same process, again, choosing the Singapore zone, Windows Server 2008 R2. Now this particular instance is going to be my terminal services, or as it's now known, my remote desktop services machine. This is going to be my application server. Again, I want to be able to host 100 concurrent users. So in this particular instance, I'm going to make this machine the same. I'm going to give it 8 cores, 20 gigahertz, and 40 gigabytes of RAM. So then I'll go to step 3. This machine, the data disk, doesn't need to be so large because, again, all this is going to hold is my running application. So I'm going to make this a 500 gig data disk. So then I'll go to step 4. Again, internet connected. I'm going to give this a name. So this will be SBO Demo CL. I'm going to call this RDS 1. And that's all good. So then I'll say select, and that's now been created. Now you'll see whilst I was doing that, my SQL Server has now been created. Remember, you have to take a note of what this password is because you're going to need that the very first time you log on. We'll now have this other machine, this other instance being created. So then I'm going to go and I'm going to add my third instance now. And this instance is going to be for my Cloud Control Center and my storage. So I will, again, choose Singapore as the zone. Windows 2008 R2. Go to step 2. Now this machine doesn't need to be as high powered. So I'm going to give this 2 cores and 4 gig of RAM. I'll go to step 3. I'm going to give this a data disk of 500 gigabytes. I'll go to step 4, and it'll be internet connected virtual network. Now, one of the things that we need for our Cloud Control Center is we do need SQL Server. But in this particular instance, for the kind of load that I'm going to be running here, around about 100 accounts, I'm just going to use SQL Server Express, which is the free edition of Microsoft SQL Server 2008. So it doesn't need to be a highly powered, highly spec'd machine. That's why I've set this the way that I have. So now I'll go to step 5. All right, and I'm going to call this is my Cloud Control Center, CCC. Okay. And then my group stays as it is, and I choose submit. And that instance is now adding as well. So we'll give that a couple more seconds to allow those 2 instances to add. The next thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to log on to each one of those instances and join each of those instances to my domain. But before I do that, you'll recall in session 1, I used the built-in console inside the Instacompute web interface to do all of my interaction with those machines. Well, from this point onwards, I'm not going to do that. From now on, I'm going to start using remote desktop services and connect to my machines via remote desktop services client. But in order for me to do that, I'm going to need to now set up all of my port forwarding for my internet connectivity, open up the necessary ports on the firewalls and so on. So we're going to do that in a couple of seconds. So you can see that's now done. I've got my 3 new instances which have been created. I've made a note of the passwords for each of these 3 new instances so I can join them to my domain. So the next thing I need to do is I need to map my port forwarding. So the ports that I need to open are fairly straightforward. I'm going to be utilizing, in this particular environment, I'm going to be utilizing the SAP Business One mobile application. So I'm going to need to open up port 8080 to come into my SQL Server. I'm also going to need to open up port 80 and port 443 to come into my remote desktop server, because I'm going to be using Remote Desktop Services Gateway, which will allow me to connect and access my SAP Business One utilizing a web browser coming in over port 80 and port 443. But for the purposes of administration, in the first instance, I also need to open up port 3389 so I can have a direct remote desktop services connection into one of my consoles. And I can close that down later if I want to, once I've got all of my prep work done. So how do I do that? Well, very, very simple. You'll see here, I go to my network tab. And in the network tab, you'll see all of the IP addresses that are automatically created for me. But I can also go in here and I can create additional public IP addresses. But in the first instance, we're just going to look at our existing IP addresses. So I'll click on there. And you'll see right now I actually have 2 IP addresses. The one that I'm interested in is this one here in my Singapore zone. I'm not interested in this second IP address. That's another IP address that's been allocated for India. So in this particular instance, I don't want to access that one. I'm going to use this one here. So 180.84.41.160. That's going to be my public IP address. Now, when I do all of my IP address mapping to names on the internet, that's the IP address I'm going to use. So what do? Well, I go here and I choose port forwarding. So the first port I want to open up is port 3389. So I'll choose that. And I want to map that through to port 3389. So this is going to be my TCP/IP port, and it's going to come through and connect to my remote desktop server. So you see when I choose my drop-down list, I can see all of my instances that are available. So there it is, RDS1, and I'll add that. Give that a couple of seconds. Then we're going to go and we're going to add our next one. I'm going to add port 80. And I'm going to map this through again to RDS1 because I need this for my remote desktop services gateway. Give that a couple of seconds. I then want to map port 443 because this is going to be my HTTPS connection. And remote desktop services gateway needs both port 80 and port 443 to be open. And same again, this is going to point to RDS1. Now, important thing to note, you'll need to make sure on each of your Windows instances that the Windows firewall is letting through the appropriate network traffic as well. So I'm going to need to go in and configure the firewalls and make sure those ports are open. So we'll let that run. That's now done. So that's everything that I need right now for my remote desktop services machine. Couple of other things. You'll remember I mentioned that I wanted to access the SAP Business One mobile apps. Now they need to come in and connect to my B1I server, and that's going to be running on my SQL Server machine. I've decided I'm going to have those running on port 8080. So I'll pop those in there. And so I'm going to point that to my SQL A machine, and I'll add that. And then finally, I also need to be able to connect to my SBO CCC machine. Remember, this is my Cloud Control Center. Now, the Cloud Control Center uses a web-based user interface as well. But if I want to use just this one IP address, well, I've already used up port 80, so I'm going to want to choose a different port. So when I'm configuring my Cloud Control Center, whatever port I put in here, I'm going to need to configure the Cloud Control Center to utilize that. So I'm going to put my Cloud Control Center on port 81, because remember we're using port forwarding here and we cannot map the same port to go to two different machines. So port 81 is going to go through to my CCC. Now if I wanted to, I could leave the private port at port 80. I find it easier to make sure that my public ports and my private ports are mapped the same way. It's just easier to administer. So that's how I'm going to do it. And then I'll choose Add. Give that a couple more seconds. And then we'll be ready to go. So that's all of my port forwarding is now done. All my ports are mapped through according to the way that I want them to be. So I can now leave the Instacompute portal, if you like, and I can start connecting in to the infrastructure from a remote desktop services client. So all I need to do is remember that this is my IP address, 180.87.41.160. And then what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to map this through to my public IP or my public address name, which in this case you'll remember is sbodemocl.com. So that's what I'm going to need to map this IP address through to. But we'll talk about that a little further down the track. I'm just going to use the IP address for now. So in order to mix things up a little bit, the session 1 I recorded utilizing all of my connections on a Mac. In this session 2, I'm actually using a Windows PC and I'm running Windows 8. So I'm going to use the remote desktop client that's part of Windows to connect through to my system now. So if I quickly go in, I'll go into my Windows 8 startup and I'll go and start my remote desktop connection client. And you'll see what I've got here is my IP address of that particular computer that I made a note of. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to choose to connect. Now, it's going to automatically try and use my credentials because my Windows machine is logged in with a Windows domain account. That's okay. It's going to reject those, so I'll just go in and I'll log in with my username, and I'm going to log in with the password that was automatically created by the TATA Instacompute platform when my remote desktop services virtual machine was created. So remember, that's the machine I'm connecting to, remote desktop services. The remote desktop services client connects on port 3389. And so that's the machine that I'm going to connect to, because remember, I mapped port 3389 on this IP address to the virtual machine that is running my remote desktop services. So I'll just quickly put in my password. And I'll choose to connect. And you can see it's now connected, and there is my desktop session all ready to run. Now I don't have to worry about some of those little flickerings and some of the idiosyncrasies of the console session that's delivered through the TATA Instacompute web browser console session. This just makes it a little bit easier to access all of my different virtual machines. So let's get started. Step 1, remember, I'm going to have to join this machine to the domain. Step 2, I'm then going to configure this machine as a remote desktop server. So I'm going to have to go into my server tools and do that configuration. So one of the things that you'll recall that we had to do in order to join a machine to the domain is I needed to go in and set the DNS server IP address. So let's just go and do that right now. So I'll open up my local area connection. I'll go into my properties, go down to my TCP/IP v4, go to my properties here, and I'm going to manually set my DNS address, and then I'll say OK, and that's now done. So what I can now do is I'm able to go in and join this machine to the domain. So I'll go into my start, I'll go to control panel, Then I'll go into System, and I'll go here into my change settings. And remember, there's two things I want to do at once. I want to set my domain, and I also want to set my computer name. So my computer name is going to be SBO Demo CL RDS 1, and my domain, you'll recall, is SBO Demo CL.com, or I can just use the NetBIOS name of SBO Demo CL, and then I'll say OK, and it can now find that domain controller, and it's going to prompt me again for the username that has the rights to join a machine to the domain. So I'll log in with my administrator user and the password that I created, and I'll say OK. Give that a couple of seconds for it to join to the domain. Then, of course, once that's successful, it's going to ask me to restart this machine, which is fine. I'm going to do that. I'll let it restart, and then we're going to reconnect with our remote desktop connection session, and we're going to configure this machine as a remote desktop server. So there you go. Welcome to the SBO Demo CL domain. That's what I wanted to see. Must restart for these changes to take effect. So I'll say close, restart now. You'll see that will log off, and then it brings me back out into my Windows 8 session. So let's reconnect. We'll give it actually, before I reconnect, I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds for that reboot to take place. So now our virtual machine should have finished restarting. So I'll choose connect again. I'm going to use another account, and this time I'm able to put in my domain name, which, as you'll remember, is SBO Demo CL, and my username is going to be administrator. And this time I can use the administrator password from the domain controller. So I'm going to pop that in there, and I'll say OK. And we've now connected. It's logging on using those domain credentials, so that tells me that this machine has now been joined to the domain successfully. So step 2 in this process then is to go and configure this machine as my remote desktop server. So in order to do that, I'm going to need to go into my server tools. So I'll start that up just by clicking on the icon down here on the taskbar. And you'll see this brings up my server manager. And I now want to add the necessary roles to this machine. So I'll go here into roles, and I'll say add role. And I'll say next. Alright, so what do I want this machine to be? Well, I want it to be a remote desktop server. So I want to put remote desktop services on it. And I also want to have this machine running as my web server, because I've got some additional components which obviously need the Internet Information Server role to be installed on this machine. Remote desktop gateway, for example, and the remote desktop web access. So that's that. Is there anything else I want on here? Nope, that's pretty much it. Now the good thing is that if there are additional roles or features that need to be installed as a result of making these choices, then Windows Server is going to tell me that I need to add those. So I'll say next. And now it's going to ask me to specifically say which components of Windows Desktop or remote desktop services do I want to include. So I want this to be my remote desktop session host. I want this to also be my remote desktop gateway. And you'll see again it's saying These are the role services you need to add, so I'm going to tell it to add those. And then I also want remote desktop web access, and so I'm going to add those required role services here as well. Couple of other things that I do need to have access to a remote desktop licensing server. Now, you can put the remote desktop licensing services on the remote desktop server. I don't recommend doing that. I'm going to put the remote desktop licensing, I'm going to install that on my domain controller. All right? So I don't want to have the possibility of people getting in and starting to poke around with my remote desktop licensing by having it on the remote desktop server. So I'm going to leave that unconfigured for now. I'm going to come back and I'm going to add that to my domain controller. Now, if you're going to end up with multiple remote desktop servers and you want to do load balancing, then you're going to need to install the remote desktop connection broker on one of your remote desktop servers. Right now, I'm just having the one, so I don't need to install that, so I'm going to leave that unticked for now. So I'll say next, and it's just warning me, hey, you're now putting on remote desktop services. So if you've installed any applications prior to this, you're probably going to need to uninstall them and reinstall them so that they will run in remote desktop services mode. But I haven't done that, so that's not an issue. And that's why this is very important to follow a very specific series of steps. So I'll say next. Do I want network level authentication or do I not? Well, I'm going to say I don't want network level authentication because I want to be able to cope with a variety of different clients that are going to connect to this machine. So that's the best thing to do. It's going to ask me my licensing mode. I'm going to license per user. So I'm going to be using a remote desktop services per user CAL for my licensing mode. So I'll say next. And then which users can connect to this host server? Well, in this particular instance, I'm going to allow everyone that's set up on my domain to connect to the applications on this server. I can create different groups if I want to. Again, you'll want to think about your security model, but for now, I'm just going to allow my domain users group, and I'll check that name. That's a standard Windows domain that contains everybody that gets created on the domain. I'm going to add my domain users group. So anybody that's a member of this group can log on or can access applications on this host server. And then I'll say next. Now, do I want any additional features like audio and video playback, audio recording, desktop composition, which gives me the user interface of Windows Aero? Well, if all I'm doing is hosting SAP Business One here, I don't need any of those things. All right? So I'm just going to leave them unticked and I'll say next. Because again, by the way, those things will chew up additional processing resources on my machine. The next thing I'm going to need to do, because I'm using SSL, is I will need to install an SSL certificate on this machine. I'm going to come back to that configuration step a little further down the track. So I'm going to tell the system here that I want to choose a certificate for the SSL encryption later. All right, we'll go through that process a little later. So then I'll say next. Now the next thing I need is a remote desktop connection authorization policy, and I also need a remote desktop resource authorization policy. So I'm going to create those policies now, and I'm just going to create basic policies. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of all of this, but this is for the remote desktop gateway because you can potentially allow your users to access other machines on the network. Again, this is traditional Windows Server functionality, but I'm not really going to be too worried about it. But I will, in this particular instance, I'm going to add my domain users to this group, and I'll say next, and I will tell it that my remote desktop authorization policy, my connection authorization policy is going to use passwords and not smart cards. So I'll say next. I'll use the default here, and then I'll say, when people connect through this remote desktop gateway, I can control which computers they can have access to. So in this particular instance, I can browse out to a particular computer group. Again, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of configuring all of your security. I'm expecting that there'll be somebody inside your organization who understands that. I'm just going to allow users to connect to any computer that's on the network, and I'm going to utilize some other security mechanisms to block them from connecting to those computers anyway, which you'll see shortly how I do that. But then I'll say next. That's now done. I'll say next. Now, couple of other things it's asking me that I may want to choose. All right, do I want to choose routing and remote access services? Do I want to have VPN functionality here and so on? No, I don't. So I'll say next. Now it's going to ask me to configure my IIS. So in my IIS, I've got my ASP.NET, my .NET extensibility, all the basic functionality that I need for the system to work according to my requirements for delivering SAP Business One on demand. And these are all preset. I am going to add my management scripts and tools and my management service. Alright, I'm going to utilize my IIS 6 scripting tools, and this is just something I do as a matter of course because you never know if there are going to be additional applications that you're going to want to deploy, like, for example, maybe some SSP solutions that may require IIS 6. Now, you can add them later if you want. Personally, I prefer to add those tools up front. So, they're selected. I'll now say next. That's all good. It's referring, or rather, it's presenting me with a list of what's going to happen. I can check this now, make sure I'm happy with everything that's there, and then I'll choose install, and then I'll let the installation run. That's now done, and as you can see, a restart is required for all those things to take effect. So I'll choose close at the end of this installation process. Do I want to restart now? And I'll say yes. That's going to log off. The system's now going to restart again, so I'll let it restart and then we'll come back in. So we'll connect back in again, and you'll see this time it's actually remembering that these are the user credentials that I want to connect with. So again, just put in the password. And it connects to my session, and it will now continue on with the configuration that needs to be done on this machine. So you can now see it's resuming the configuration, taking care of those last few steps. Just reminding me that there's a few warnings, a few more configuration steps I need to do. I'm going to come back and do those configuration steps a little later. So I'll say close, and then I'll close this. And of course, it's now telling me that there's no remote desktop license server specified yet. That's because I have to go back and install the remote desktop license service on my domain controller, because remember, that's where I'm going to put that. Now, I've got this one session that's available for me to connect to now via remote desktop services. How do I connect to all the other machines that I've got in my system? Well, that's quite easy now that I've got this machine configured. If I click here on Start and I go into Administrative Tools, you'll now see under Remote Desktop Services, I now have this option here, Remote Desktops. So this gives me a Microsoft Management Console, or MMC, that I can use this Remote Desktop snap-in with. So now I can add all of my other machines on the network to this snap-in. So for example, let's say I want to be able to connect to my domain controller. Well, again, I just go in here and I say add new connection. So it's SBO demo CL domain controller. And I want to connect with the admin option because I want to connect to the console. I want it to allow me to save my credentials. And so then I'll say OK to that. So that's now there in my list. Let's say I want to also be able to connect to my backup domain controller. SBO demo CL BDC. So I can now connect to that machine as well. And then I can connect to all of my other machines or my other virtual machines using remote desktop services to connect to them through this tool. So I'm just going to move that across there a little bit to give myself the maximum amount of space over here. I'm going to go and choose File, Save As, because I want to save these configuration settings. I'm going to pop that on my desktop. So now, anytime I want to get back to that, I just double click there on that option on the desktop. If I want to connect to the domain controller, one click, and you'll see here it is. It's connecting to the domain controller. So a remote desktop session within a remote desktop session. Makes it very, very easy for me to now do all of my administration. So there it is. I'll give that a couple of seconds for that to connect. And then I'm also able to do the same thing with my backup domain controller. So you'll see that's now connected. So if I go here to the backup domain controller, same thing. Remember my credentials. And so now I can toggle between those two sessions. All right, so I could do all of my management of all of my machines from here. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And then of course when I'm finished, I just click on here and choose log off. That's that session ended. Go up here and I can choose log off there as well. And that's that session ended. And I can reconnect to any of those sessions at any particular point in time. So what I want to do right now, I do want to go ahead and configure the remote desktop licensing services on my domain controller. So let's right click on there and we'll choose connect. I'm going to go into my server manager here. I'm going to go into my roles. I'm going to add a role. It takes a couple of seconds just for it to collect the data necessary for it to present me with this screen. There it is. So I'll add a role. And I'll say next. Now here's one of the little idiosyncrasies that you may run into with some of these wizards and some of these screens is occasionally they don't necessarily fit into the screen size that you've selected here. Now I am recording this using a 1280 by 720 screen size, so that's one of the reasons why it's a little bit difficult for you to see the buttons that are down the bottom here that I want to click on. All right, but take my word for it, that is the next button that I'm clicking on. So then I want to go in here and I'll say I want to add remote desktop services. And then I'll click on next. And then next. And then which role services do I want? And all I want here is remote desktop licensing, none of the other components. And then I'll say next. Again, it can be a little bit tricky just getting it to click on that button. You can, of course, use your tab key. I'm going to configure a discovery scope for this license server, and this is just saying this license server is going to service all of the remote desktop services on this domain, or if you've got multiple domains in a forest, it can service the entire forest. So I'm just going to say this is going to service this domain, but again, it really does depend on how you're configuring your cloud infrastructure. So I'll say next. Now, if you are really struggling with this, of course, one of the things you can do is you can just simply click on here and you can minimize your taskbar down, or you can move the taskbar across to the side, and then you'll see those buttons now become a little bit easier to access. So I'll say install. That's now running fine. And then after this has gone through successfully, I'm then going to need to activate this remote desktop services license server with Microsoft and install my licenses on it. I'm not going to go through that process again. I'm going to assume that you will be able to do that yourself once you have established your licensing relationship with Microsoft. So I'll say close. So that's now done successfully. I'll move my start bar back down the bottom, and that's done, so that's okay. And then I'll log off again. And if I come back here now, one of the things you'll see if I go into my administrative tools from my remote desktop server, I can now go into my remote desktop session host configuration, and I can now tell it where to find that license server. Alright, so I just go in here and you'll see it's got remote desktop license servers not specified. I'll just simply double click on that. And I will say it's per user, and then I will add my license server. And you can see it's now automatically detected that that license server is there. I'll add that across, say OK, and apply, and that's it. My license server is now specified and configured as well. So that's done. Next step is I want to now go and configure my SQL server and my Cloud Control Center server. Again, I'm going to go through the same process. I'm going to join those machines to the domain, and then we're going to come back after we've done that, and we're going to install the different components. So I'm not going to run through that process of joining those machines to the domain again. You've seen that enough times now, so hopefully that will be very, very easy for you to follow. So I'm just going to go and quickly do those myself now, and then we'll come back and continue on with our next step, which will be installing SQL Server, installing SAP Business One on that SQL Server, configuring SAP Business One on our remote desktop server, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to install the Cloud Control Center on our Cloud Control Center server.